Hello and welcome back to those of you who watched part 1. If that's not you, then I am Jim Leck and I'm a high school AP economics teacher right here in good old Nashville, Tennessee. This video is going to cover a difficult AP macro problem concerning aggregate supply and aggregate demand. In order to maintain brevity, I will be referencing video 1 in the spots where it's important to do so, rather than re-examining that theory in this video. Still, if your understanding of aggregate supply and aggregate demand is rather strong, you should be able to use this video to analyze the problem correctly. If not, go back and watch part 1 right now, at least the first 3 minutes. We are going to use this video to quickly and confidently push through the problem with clear graphs and correct answers. At this point, I'll bring in new theories and definitions only where I need to, so that you walk away with full credit for the problem and full understanding of the complex issues as well. Let's go. I want to give you a little bit of assistance on how to stop using these videos as crutches for your intellectual growth, because that tends to be how this works. What you're going to want to do in my videos is pause when I tell you to pause, and I'm going to tell you to do that very soon. It doesn't matter how little you know about this issue or any other one. Simply try to do the work yourself before I do it for you. While the video is on pause, your first refuge, if you fail, is to go to your textbook before hitting the play button. After you have given it a good shot with your textbook, hit the play button and come back and watch me do it. Now, this is a more comprehensive approach to learning with obvious benefits, yet I know it takes a lot longer to do it. But that's the life of a student. If you can't handle that, then as a person who teaches economics for a living, I'd say quit and do something else, because opportunity costs are always rising. In summary, be an active learner in your education. My doctorate is in education, and the data shows this approach is basically the difference between the grade of an A and everything else. The choice is yours. Here's the complete setup to the problem. In a second, I'm going to ask you to pause your video so that you can try it yourself with the help of your textbook if necessary. When you come back, I will go through this point by point, and then I will draw it out for you. You can compare your drawing to mine at that time. But until then, hit the pause button and give it a shot. Looks like we're going to need a long-run aggregate supply, a short-run line, and an aggregate demand line, all for Canada. We still have this notable premise. The Canadian employment rate is higher than its natural rate. As I said in video 1, we're going to note the contrapositive and move forward. Now we have to show these 3 items, but we're going to take these 2 first. We know that the price level and that the real output are going to be generated when we simply draw in our aggregate lines, so that shouldn't be too much of a problem. The next item, however, is a problem. We don't really know what this is going to look like just by looking at it, but there is a clue in the setup of the question. The price level is accounted for, the current real output is accounted for, because they're going to come from these items right here. The only thing left for the full employment level must somehow be related to the long-run aggregate supply. We're going to use this deduction against the test makers because it works every time. Let's go to the drawing and I'll show you how it's done. No surprises here. You'll note that we have the price level on the y-axis, the real GDP on the x-axis, and most importantly up here in the corner,
how's it going, eh?
I labeled what my graph is, and depending on how tough the graders are, you better have that. Why give them an opportunity to take away a point for something so simple? It's now time to start drawing this graph. But starting with the chronological order, which is exactly what I have here from the problem, may not be the best way to do it. It's sort of like opening up a puzzle and then start to put it together from the first piece you grab. The intelligent approach is to at least put the border together, and we're going to emulate that type of thinking here. The easiest thing to do is to grab the low-hanging fruit. We're going to denote the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply, and then we are going to mark the price level 1 and the real output 1. Well, we're left with the 2 problem children, long-run aggregate supply and the full employment output, and trying to figure out how we can use the bottom to draw the top. I think it's time to go to the whiteboard and talk about how full employment affects aggregate supply. The full employment rate of Canada is roughly 94%, which also defines their workforce. That means out of every 100 Canadians who are both willing and able to hold down at least a part-time job have one. While the other 6 people are all able to work, some of them can't find a job at all, and the rest are only willing to work if the right job for them comes around. So how long does it take for people to start moving from column A to to column B before the economy is dealing with somewhat unsettling situations because it's no longer at the 94-96 split, which is traditional, and by the way, all the other economic indicators are geared for that ratio. The answer is it doesn't take long at all. In our hypothetical, we have a situation where people are coming from unemployment to employment. So we'll just say we're at 96% employment and only 4% unemployment. That means there are 2 workers out of every 100 that are earning more money that they weren't used to having before. And by the way, they're spending it and they're saving it, both of which create a situation for added GDP. The other aspect that we have to acknowledge is that these 2 individuals are in the workforce and they're producing some sort of goods and services, aren't they? Otherwise, what else would they be doing there? So that means aggregate supply is going up because of these 2 individuals. And if this is basically the proxy for aggregate demand is also going up as well. What does all this mean for the long run aggregate supply? Let's look at it more broadly. Here's our situation with our aggregate demand and our aggregate supply. If this is the situation where employment is up, then this equilibrium represents an overheated economy for all the reasons we just went over. It looks like it's normal, but the situations that created this aggregate supply and this aggregate demand had those 2 extra people spending money down here and making things up here. And therefore, if it's overheated, then somewhere over here is where it's supposed to be. And that is the indicator to where we will draw our long-run aggregate supply. Let's go back and have it all nicely drawn so that we can tackle the next 3 questions. It's probably a good idea to get an overview of the 3 questions before we start jumping in and ripping them apart to see what we can do to forge a correct answer. Well, right off the bat, we're going to deal with a second premise. Let's see what it is. Canadian businesses are investing more in physical expansion of their plants and general equipment increases. Plants. There are 2 things I want you to understand whenever you're dealing with the increase of physical plant space in an economics question. 1, it only happens in the long run. Think about what has to occur to increase your business footprint. You're going to have to involve architects, engineers, God forbid, lawyers, electricians, plumbers, you name it, they're all involved. It takes a long time. Secondly, it also takes a lot of money. If you're going to be increasing the footprint of your business or perhaps building a second location, then you're going to be spending a lot of money. And well-run businesses do not have stockpiles of money just sitting around waiting for that day. No, rather they invested it back into their own business in smaller ways, but on an ongoing basis to where there wouldn't be a whole bunch of money stockpiling up to begin with. Secondly, if you have extra money around and you don't want to invest it in your business, they probably redistribute it back to their investors in the hopes of it getting more investiture in the future. In either event, they're going to have to go to the bank and borrow the money, and that's the second germane point. Will either of these things be involved in the questions? I don't know, but I want you to be ready in case they are. All right, we will take these questions one at a time when we start trying to forge the correct answer. But as I said in the beginning, we're going to get a general overview. So the first question is going to involve what happens after this increased investment works its way through the economy. I'm guessing it's going to involve some sort of line shifting to or fro, or maybe both AD and AS move, or maybe neither of them do. We will see. Read this question carefully. It says fiscal policy, not monetary policy. Fiscal policy means decisions to tax or spend by political authorities to affect current or future economic conditions. It's messier and slower than monetary policy, which is run by the central bank to control the money supply. Be sure you know the difference. Thirdly, what if the Canadian government decides to sit back and do nothing? What happens as a result on the short-run aggregate supply? Will it increase, decrease, or stay the same? Well, we're going to have to take these one at a time so that we can get a correct answer to number 3 when we get there. Let's start that process right now. So what is going to be the result of all of this increased business investiture from the businesses themselves? Well, I would imagine your mind might go to an increased aggregate supply. You might think, well, Dr. Leck, didn't you say in the previous video from the acronym SPITE that the P stood for productivity? And that if you're going to be increasing your physical plant size and loading it up with a whole bunch of new equipment, you're certainly going to be more productive. And I would say, I like where your head's at, but that's not going to help you do well in economics. economics because you are focusing on a second order effect. That second order effect comes after it's purchased. In addition, we don't know whether or not they're going to be more productive. That is a pretty big assumption. What if all the plant sizes increase and then there's a recession? The one thing we do know is that the second premise said that businesses, plural, are going to be spending money on physical plant size and new equipment. And as I said, plant size expansion is expensive, and I'm guessing it's going to be a lot of businesses. Otherwise, they would have said a smaller amount. So if a lot of businesses are spending a lot of money, the one thing that you can bank on is that aggregate expenditure is going to increase. And so the aggregate demand line is going to shift to the right. Now we go over here to the question. After we have determined what happens with our new line, we have to show the remarks on the equilibrium price and the real output. Well, that's doing nothing more than drawing in our new dotted lines. And so the equilibrium price will now be marked here as EQ2, done, and the real output. We might as well put in our new price level as well. That would give us full credit on this question. Let's go to the next one. Identify one fiscal policy here in question 2 that the Canadian government can implement to return the economy to full employment. Well, wait a minute. Where's full employment? Oh, remember when we had that whiteboard discussion? That was to determine that the LRAS is in fact full employment. I've been waiting till now to pencil it in. Here we go. Okay, it looks like we have to get an equilibrium 3 onto this line, and there's more than one place we can locate it. If you watched video 1, you're in a particularly good position to figure out how to do this. If you have not watched video 1, I would encourage you to do that and come back to this question. That being said, let's continue. So we're going to have to shift through government action one of these two lines, either the AS or the AD line, to get back to the long-run aggregate supply line. Since this video series mostly focused on aggregate supply, I think it's a good time to go back and look at that slide where we had the 5 shifters of aggregate supply fully delineated. Here we are, and there's that acronym I referenced before, SPITE. Take a good look at these 5 shifters. Which ones do you think are the domain of the government? If you said subsidies and taxes on businesses, you are correct. So what policies could the Canadian government implement in order to change the aggregate supply line? Well, as you may recall from the first video, if you increase subsidies, then you end up increasing the aggregate supply line and push it to the right. If you decrease subsidies or just merely take them away, then you will most certainly push the aggregate supply line to the left. When it comes to taxes on business, it's even more obvious. If you increase taxes on businesses, you raise their costs. When you raise the cost of a business, you make it more difficult to continue to put out the volume that they have been doing so already. Thus, when you raise taxes on businesses across the board, you will fundamentally shift the amount of supply that your producers can put into the marketplace. And so when taxes on businesses go up, the aggregate supply line moves to the left, and vice versa. Whenever you have the taxes decrease, you are allowing businesses to have more of their funding to put back into their businesses. So it's not surprising that when taxes on businesses decrease, you will see that the aggregate supply line gets pushed to the right. Okay, that's the discussion we needed to have. Let's go back to the graph. It's time to make things a little more clear. On the LRAS, you'll see 3 possible spots we can locate a new equilibrium 3. We can move the aggregate demand line to intersect the aggregate supply line here, or we can move the AS line to intersect one of the 2 AD lines seen here. So do we shift the aggregate supply or the aggregate demand line? And how do we explain why it's shifting? One thing that we could do is we could use the notion of subsidies or taxation to push the aggregate supply line so that it intersects the most recent aggregate demand line. And the most recent aggregate demand line is right here, at AD2. And where does AD2 intersect the LRAS? Right there. So what can we do with the aggregate supply line that pushes it to that intersection? Well, let's draw it out and make sure we're looking at it correctly. It's right here. That would in fact create EQ3. We'll jot that in here. And how was it done? it was done by pushing the aggregate supply line to the left. And so how would we write this answer? Well, don't forget, we only need one. You do not volunteer two, because if you try to get fancy and put two out there and you get one wrong, they're going to dock you for having incorrect information, but you're not going to get any extra credit for having both, so pick one. What is more concrete to wrap your mind around? Subsidies or taxes? I'd say taxes. All you would have to do is say that the Canadian legislature can increase taxes on business in order to return the economy to full employment. This is not a graphing question. You don't have to show any of it. It's one that is written down, and we just nailed it. Of course, you could shift the aggregate demand line all the way over to the LRAS if you would like to try to change the equilibrium that way. Now, as I've said before, this video did not cover all of the key shifters of the aggregate demand line, save one, personal income taxes. So, considering personal income taxes, what can you do to shift the aggregate demand line? Well, if income taxes go up, then aggregate demand will go to the left. And if you take your income taxes and you reduce them, then aggregate demand will go to the right. And that makes sense because you're taking away people's disposable income when you increase taxes, and you are adding to it when you decrease taxes. So let's take a look down here at the aggregate supply line. There's only one, so we see that it intersects the LRAS right there. How could we use taxation methods from the Canadian legislature on the people in order to push the aggregate demand line to intersect right here? Well, let's draw it in first, as I always suggest, and then we can label it. Well, it looks like we would be pushing it pretty far to the left. Which one of these would that be? It's this one. You could say the Canadian legislature can increase personal income taxes to return the economy to full employment. Pick one of these two. It doesn't matter. You're going to get full credit. We have finally made it to the final question, and what a surprise. The Canadian politicians are choosing to do nothing about the overheated economy. Well, you can't blame them, can you? Let's review their three choices. They could remove existing subsidies from businesses, or they could vote to increase the taxes on those businesses, and everyone's favorite, they can vote to increase the personal income taxes on the whole population. Like that's gonna happen. You know, even one of my own students asked me if this was a trick question, because politicians wouldn't want to return to full employment if that means people would lose the quote extra unquote jobs they apparently wanted in the first place, right? I told him it's not a trick question. It's just counterintuitive. You might even see questions here that ask you how central banks could induce a recession. Thus, answer AP questions seriously. Secondly, inflation is rising here, and that's not good. Regardless of the cause, fiscal and monetary policies are proven nostrums to put inflation in check quickly. So, the politicians should do something, but they won't. Those three options are political suicide. And that leads us right back to the question, what's the result of the political inaction on the SRAS? Will it increase, decrease, or stay the same in the long run? If you watch the first video, then you have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. In that scenario, we detailed my hypothetical business raising the cost of my widget from $7 to $7.10. And then we went through how in the short run, that 10 cents gets slowly chipped away until the last penny of it is gone, and then we find ourselves immediately in the long run. Let's go through a more concrete, real-world example of that to make sure we're all on the same page in order to answer this third and final question correctly. Consider a Canadian Walmart. It's a lot like an American Walmart, except that the people inside are about 20 times nicer. Now suppose that the Fritos of the Canadian Walmarts are outselling all the other chips, maybe even combined. Walmart decides to raise the prices of those chips, and they do so to the tune of 15 cents per bag. A pretty big hike, but let's just say that individuals keep buying it. Now I know that Fritos are far from an inelastic good. They have numerous substitutes, but I don't want to go down a microeconomics wormhole here. I just want to use this as an example to talk about aggregate supply overall. So Walmart is now making even more money, even though they lost a little bit of their customers for the Fritos. They're still pretty happy with their decision. Well, I would imagine that the people who aren't going to be happy about it are these people. After all, they're the ones who make these salty, fatty, corny chips that everyone seems to love. And oh, by the way, they're the ones pouring a ton of money into advertising it. So no wonder that these items are selling out at the rate that they are. They go to Walmart and they say, we want a dime of that 15 cents. Now, you can only push an 800-pound gorilla around in negotiations for so long. That's why they didn't ask for all 15 cents. Walmart acquiesces, gives them a dime. They're still getting an extra 5 cents on money they wouldn't have had anyway. But there's another group that notices that the prices have gone up in Walmart, particularly on things that are selling well, like Fritos. And it's these guys, the hard frontline workers that make all of the Walmart sales possible.
Screw them.
Walmart acquiesces again, gives them the nickel.
What?
And look where they're at. They're back where they started, basically making normal profit on a bag of Fritos. And that is exactly how they leave the short run into the long run. Consider the technical definition of the short run. Hey Cortana, what's the definition of the short run aggregate supply?
LRAS is the measure of aggregate supply that begins when price levels of goods and services increase but input prices, such as wages and raw materials, remain constant.
Let's make sure you understand that definition. She said that you were in the short run aggregate supply until the precise moment when your final resource cost rises to the proportional hike that you have put on your final good or service produced for the economy at large. When that happens, you are then in the long run. And we saw that's precisely what happened in this scenario between Frito-Lay, Walmart, and their employees. Let's go back to the graph we've been working on this whole time to take a good look at this process visually. Then we'll be in an excellent position to combine that work with the theories of both the short run and the long run we've been expounding here, all in order to formulate a correct and concise answer to the third and final question. I'll see you there. Here's the graph. Let's recall what happened to get us to this point. We started off in equilibrium 1, which was in fact overheated from the very beginning and off the LRAS because the employment rate in Canada was higher than the full employment rate. Then the second premise had the aggregate demand line shift to the right because Canadian businesses were buying new equipment, but more importantly, they were spending a lot of money on increasing their physical plant size. As a result, we ended up at equilibrium 2. The price levels rose for the whole country as well as the real output. Escalating inflation isn't tenable for any society. Thus, 3 courses of fiscal policy were determined that the Canadian government could use to shed the extra jobs and revert back to full employment. However, we noted that each one was political suicide. That leads us right to the question, what will be the result of the lack of government intervention on the short-run aggregate supply? Will it decrease? Will it increase? Will it stay the same? Let's talk about it. Think about the story I've been weaving here to deconstruct this problem. Canada's aggregate demand rose, causing more goods to be bought coast to coast, including all those Fritos at Walmart. When you're in the short run, you can raise your prices as we saw with those Fritos, but subsequently they lost those proceeds to their resource providers. And I'm guessing in the real world they would have lost a little bit more than the 15 cents as well. But Walmart was far from the only ones raising prices in the short run. Look at that y-axis. It was the whole country. That includes Frito-Lay, who has multiple resource costs of their own, including a drove of employees and their wages. What do you think happened to Frito-Lay's extra dime they were getting from the Walmart sales? You got it, their short-run surplus was eventually gobbled up by their own input costs in the long run. Back to the problem at hand. What will ultimately occur in the short run to the aggregate supply line when the politicians remain on the sidelines? Put it all together now to get the answer. The massive business investiture born from the overheated economy with the high employment level caused prices to rise on final goods and services in the short run. The rising prices eventually permeated the entire economy, including the intermediate goods, forcing the economy into the long run. Now, recall the primary shifters of the aggregate supply line and the acronym SPITE. What did the I stand for? And what happens to the aggregate supply line when input costs for a country rise? It moves to the left. And that's exactly what will happen here if the government intervenes or not. It'll just be a much longer time horizon for the short-run aggregate supply line to move back naturally onto the long-run aggregate supply line. Here's the nice and neat AP answer. Without government intervention, the short-run aggregate supply line in Canada will, over a longer period of time, move leftwards towards the long run as businesses face increasing costs for their resources and/or labor. Well, that wraps up another AP Econ video because this problem is solved. My name is Jim Leck, and I enjoyed making this video for you, so I hope you enjoyed watching it. The only thing left for you to do now is to memorize the shifters of the aggregate demand line so that whenever you see these questions in the future, you will have everything you need to get them 100% correct. Maybe I'll make a video on that in the future, but until that day, keep thinking like an economist. You're going to be better off for it in the long run.